continuation of the Plan Change 14 briefing we had there earlier on. I'd like to welcome Mark, Ike and Brent to the stand, who will be discussing Plan Change 14. This continues our public information session held on the 29th of October. Thank you, gentlemen. Fire away.
Thanks for that, Mayor. Look, we've got nothing to add really in terms of introduction to this session. The council was making really good progress at the last session. The objective was, again, to go through what we're calling the big table. And we spent some time introducing the table and what the purpose of it is. We spent a little bit of time in reminding everyone of the basic requirements of your decision making when you're in the council meeting, to make sure you have regard to all relevant information and disregard anything that's irrelevant, and it's irrelevant if it's not in the IHP information. Our objective today, we'll get straight into it, it's to get back into the big table. We got up to, I think it was page 7 of 25 in our last session. These are the questions that we're focused on, line by line, going through, or page by page, going through the big table. Do you need any more information in order to be fully informed? Is there anything that you're considering not accepting and proposing something different? Of those decisions that are made on IHP recommendations for outside of the Policy 3 area, is there anything that you want to decide on in this December rather than putting off until next year? They're the questions, line by line, through that table. Mike.
Great. Thanks, Brent. Like Brent talked about, we have gone through, in terms of the big table, effectively all of the qualifying matters. And we're about to launch into the walking catchments response. There were, as you will recall, there are a number of alternative recommendations that we had noted throughout the table, and there have been some evolution, I guess, of some of those ideas which I thought was worthwhile to share. So Councillor McDonald talked about having a potential alternative regarding the airport qualifying matter for noise, and the alternative that has been put forward is effectively to change the control from applying the consent from 4 units or more to 3 units or more, so being slightly more restrictive there, and also to remove the limited notification clause regarding notification to the Christchurch airport as well, which is on the operative plan. So absent written approval, there has to be notification or approval from the airport as well. And so that has been an alternative that has been raised so far from Councillor McDonald. In addition to that, we also talked about heritage items, settings and features. It was raised from Councillor Harrison Hunt around Antonio Hall, and that has also been raised as an alternative to seek the removal of the heritage listing for Antonio Hall as well. In the same vein as well, it was discussed about the residential heritage area for Pico Shands, and so that is outside of a Policy 3 area, but can be decided on as well. The IHP recommendation was to reject the residential heritage areas, or all of them, including this one, and so it doesn't need an alternative, and so it's simply just about noting that the recommendation to reject is accepted as well on that specific heritage item, so heritage area as well. In terms of the airport, I think it's there's a couple of things I wanted to, I guess, just clarify for the provisions that have been put forward or recommended by the hearings panel. So at the moment, there are controls for acoustic insulation within the respective airport noise contours. That has been accepted and continued for the updated or remodeled contours as well. So that means that for any new dwelling, so regardless of how many units there are, there's a requirement there for additional noise insulation. In addition to that, the IHP have also recommended including ventilation requirements as well. And so again, that applies for any unit that is constructed within that contour as well. So, in terms of table, I thought we'll just continue, like I said, where we're up to. So, on this page, if we just zoom out, we had just started discussing the walking catchment responses. So, on this page, we've got the walking catchments around the central city and around the large town centres, being Riccarton, Hornby, and Papanui. The IHP had recommended for the city centre to have a walking catchment that is more or less just the 4 avenues, rather than the 1.2 kilometre and further that had been notified by council. There is an alternative recommendation that has been drafted by Councillor Templeton that's being worked on, and the current draft that we have is as follows. And so there's the extension in terms of where the IHP is, which is in yellow, further north on Beeley Ave, connecting to the high density extent around Merivale. And then to the south, it's to capture what was proposed to be the mixed use area for Sydenham, but doesn't include the Phillipstown area or anywhere really that's east of Fitzgerald Ave as well. In terms of the catchments around the larger town centres, there was an alternative that had been drafted by Councillor Harrison Hunt that we talked about, which was this one, in terms of extending the catchments for Church Corner and then connecting this to Riccarton. That has since been developed further to focus just on Riccarton, so there isn't an alternative for the Church Corner catchment. Again, this includes the Antonio Hall listing that's there. It also seeks to reflect the additional alternative recommendation to reject the rejection of the Riccarton Bush interface, but then also to extend the catchment further south to include the Stockyard site, which is just shown on the cursor there. So this is the latest update in terms of the alternative from Councillor Harrison Hunt for Riccarton. Any questions or clarifications on this page before we move on to the next centres?
Tyler?
Kia ora, guys. We're in the public sphere now, so I've just got to ask some questions just to clarify some things and put them into layman's terms. If we could refer to the central Riccarton map.
Yep.
I know that you can't put the noise overlays on the top area around Darville and Kilmarnock, but could you just define exactly where the noise overlay hangs and to what level is allowed within that small catchment between Riccarton Road, Kilmarnock, Darville, Merivale Ave?
Sure. So effectively, it's most, if not all, places that are north of Riccarton Road here, which I'm circling in my cursor, and then also the area that isn't shown on the orange further to the south along here as well. So it's this kind of archway, if you will, that overlaps the commercial extent.
Yep.
Like I said, any new residential unit within that overlay requires additional insulation and also mechanical ventilation to mitigate against the effects of noise. The IHP have recommended that any development that is 4 units or more, there will be an additional resource consent requirement, noting that under the framework there's a consent anyway that's required for any other 4 or more unit development. But in this case, there would be a specific consideration of reverse sensitivity effects, basically the ongoing operation, maintenance, upgrade of the airport. Also, the IHP have recommended that the operative, like I mentioned earlier, notification provision about requiring limited notification from the airport is also continued for this area. Like I said, there is an alternative recommendation put forward by Councillor MacDonald that would seek the removal of that notification threshold and also change the threshold for the number of units that would kick in at 3 units rather than 4 units as well.
Okay, so Councillor MacDonald's, in layman's terms, Councillor MacDonald's amendment addresses the noise overlay by removing the need to notify the airport.
That's right. The caveat I'd add to that is, like with most developments, under the Act we have the ability to notify if there isn't any exclusion stated in the Act, and this would apply here as well. So it's called a Section 95 test to see in terms of effects on the airport. So it doesn't mean to say that in any future development scenario the airport wouldn't be notified, but that decision rests with council rather than stating it will be notified.
Okay, I see. And the next one is around the requirement for additional noise insulation requirements. So just to be clear, I'm going to talk about the two town centres here. So you're looking at Matipo Street, or west, I guess, south, what we're looking at on the map. So that unshaded area, the non-shaded area, is the part which sits within the noise overlay at the moment.
I might just pick up this map, sorry, just to make it a bit clearer. So effectively in this, everything which is in the hatched is where the contour applies. Again, we're only making a decision on the high density extent, and so that's why the previous map is just focused on that extent that's here. So that's that shaded out area here, and like I said, everything that's north really of Riccarton Road is covered off there as well. There are, like you say, other areas further than the medium density that are covered, but it's not being decided on this year.
So MRZ is allowed, so they don't need to gain consent from the airport if they wanted to build medium residential zone in the medium residential zone.
Under the recommendations from the hearings panel, they would have to seek written approval. For anything that is covered in that hatched area, the operative notification threshold applies. And so if you don't obtain written approval before your application, which obviously you can do, then there is limited notification to the airport.
Okay, so Mr. Mayor, you'll probably know that there's a lot of interest in this with my ward, so I've got a couple of questions just moving down the map a little bit.
Is that why you took out the bit that joined the two of them together?
No. I did that to try and rebalance taking out the RBI.
Carry on. Yeah,
But
sorry.
anyway, the next bit is the Pico Shands Crescent area.
Yep.
And I'm really focused on developing that area for medium residentials and removing the heritage status of that. So in layman's terms, what I'll need to do is just endorse the IHP's recommendation to remove the heritage status from that area. Is that
correct? There's no alternative. There's no subject to the minister, subject to getting approval from across council.
Okay, cool. Last one is around the noise overlays. Would we be able to extend the additional noise insulation provisions within the area of UC?
That would really depend on where the evidence falls on that. On top of my mind, I can't recall any evidence that sort of greater extension. This is already really the outer, what's called the outer envelope, rather than an averaged extent. So it has to be tied to effects associated with the airport because it's managing airport effects.
Okay.
So
Why do you want to put more in?
There's heaps of noise complaints that I'm getting between long-term residentials and students. So I'm trying to protect the issues and alleviate the issues with...
So not aeroplane noise?
Aeroplane noise, it's different noise.
Yeah, I thought so.
yeah,
which will actually help a lot of people, in both getting the noise out and actually hearing the noise in. But I don't know if we can address that within the evidence that's provided.
I think there'd be a risk, of it running foul of the Waikanai case if it's constraining existing entitlements.
Yeah, there's potential for that as well, yeah.
Yep, okay, no worries.
Vic,
Thanks.
please.
Could I just clarify then on the tail end of what Tyler's done there, that we can only make amendments based on the evidence that's been before the panel, and that we can't seek to use this as a vehicle to make other changes based on residents' issues that are being raised with us outside this process?
That's right.
Correct.
Great. Okay, moving on to the next page. On this page, we have also, sorry, I missed one there. In terms of an alternative recommendation around large town centres for Hornby as well, there is an alternative recommendation from Councillor Peters regarding a slight amendment to the walking catchment around Hornby as well, which is listed there in terms of the number of streets that would be taken out. For around town centres, which is Shirley, Linwood, North Horswell and Belfast, Council had proposed a 400 metre walking catchment with high density, and the IHP had recommended 600 metres, which aligns with the final position of Council, except for North Horswell, which we discussed in the last session, which is just proposed to have medium density in the surrounds. It was raised by Councillor Moore in terms of potential for alternative recommendation, but that isn't being progressed any longer. For larger town centres, being Merivale, Sydenham and Church Corner, again, we had 400 metre catchment for high density. The IHP have accepted that, although they have changed where it's measured from. So rather than the edge, it's measured from the centre, which has reduced it there by about 20 to 30% from our estimate. The table there at the moment notes the alternative recommendation that had been previously raised by Councillor Harrison Hunt for Church Corner, which obviously doesn't apply any longer. Any questions about those? No? Great. Move on to the next page there. So on this page, we're covering off intensification around what's called medium local centres and neighbourhood centres, the lesser of the centres. We had proposed for those medium local centres basically additional precinct to enable 4 stories within between 200 to 400 metres. The IHP have recommended, instead of those specific 8 centres, that there would be a 200 metre walking catchment for all of those local centres, and that would just be MDRS. So 3 stories rather than the 4 stories that Council had proposed, and also remove the precinct that we had there to enable perimeter block development as well. We have an alternative recommendation there from Councillor MacDonald that seeks not applying Policy 3 around Pier Street and also around Avonhead local centres as well. For the neighbourhood centres, this is basically your corner dairies, are very small isolated areas. We had no walking catchment identified, just MDRS, and the panels accepted that and recommended that as well.
Before on this bit, you got a question, Tyler, on this bit?
Yeah, it was just around Sam's amendment. Is there a map for that?
No, but I can show you very quickly on here. So Pier Street is just north of Church Corner, this one through here, and then Avonhead is around the Avonhead Centre, just further to the north as well. So effectively, it would be not deciding on the Policy 3 response around those centres for decision next month. The decision would rest in the medium density response for next year.
So Pier Street's just past Villa Maria. Is that near the New World?
That's right, yeah. The New World is in the heart of that centre. Yep, that's right.
There's a lot of 2 stories there.
Yeah, so it goes to the edge of the university there.
So, sorry, just clarification, is that rejecting this?
That's
and
right.
Waiting till December next year?
Correct.
Okay.
Eric?
But rejecting it means it goes to the minister to decide.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Anything does, yeah.
If you take the map down to the edge of Hagley Park to the sale yards, because that's a blank site and would be perfect for high-rise apartments overlooking the park, so on and so forth, like there should be probably right around, can we make a special zone right there that allows that to happen, and then we can see if it does happen and then look to extend it to other areas, but trying to really encourage it there, and because living there and biking around the park and stuff is it's the dream.
Yeah, so we have an alternative from Councillor Harrison Hunt to rezone it as high density. So the IHP have recommended medium
But it's
density.
not very high.
But that's up to you if you want to progress with
What's
it.
the maximum we can allow there?
Well, it's
How many stories?
the permitted
Sorry?
How many stories?
Yeah, can we go to 10?
the permitted height is 14 metres, which is 4 stories, and then
Yeah,
there's a consent
okay.
pathway for 6 stories at 22 metres as well.
Right, but
Can
what
do
about
6 story.
by right? It's just, can we not make it that by right you can just go to 10 if you want to go to 10?
You could put an alternative on that. We'd have to look whether or not there's any submissions or evidence in support of that. I can't recall any that
Been to
are
New York?
specifically for that. We're considering submissions on the Plan Change 14, Councillor. So we have quite limitations on the evidence that's there.
Because it's such a big site, it's the perfect place to, if we're ever going to get away with trying it somewhere, that's the site to just go, this is just almost open plan, that do a comprehensive design with, everything included and
I think
ramp up.
the resource consent at the time was commercial residential,
Yeah,
123 apartments off the top of my head, along with a hotel at the front.
yeah.
And the hotel was the issue, just in my memory.
Yeah.
This could
Sounds
be slightly
about right,
incorrect,
yeah.
but and the hotel was the issue to not get that consent across the line. So I'm not sure what that would mean in terms of the scoping of if it was just residential. Could it be residential commercial within my amendment?
Look, I don't think so. No, there's no consideration of the change of zoning. It's more about the height or intensity that's there rather than the use. But if you would like, we're happy to list that down as an alternative and look to see whether or not there's any submissions or evidence in support of that.
Yeah, okay. It'd just be good to just have a shot at it. Like if it's ever going to work, that's the prime spot.
We can explore that further and come back to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions on those centres before we move on? Mm-hmm. No, great. Okay, we'll move on. So in terms of the residential building height around the centres, the first part is just the walking catchment, how far we go, and this is about the intensification that is permitted within those. So this page covers intensification around the city centre, those large centres for Riccarton, Hornby and Papanui, and also for the town centres for Shirley, Linwood, North Horswell and Belfast. For the city centre, the IHP largely accepted, if not entirely accepted, what we had recommended, or council had recommended in their final position, which is to enable 22 metres as of right, or 6 stories within most of the residential zone, but then also to add a precinct there to enable 12 stories or 39 metres closer to the centre as well. We had also had controls subject to wind effects above 20 metres, and that part of the provisions didn't survive the recommendations from the hearings panel. The same can really be said for intensification around the larger town centres. So we had notified permitted at 14 metres as high density, and that was really accepted as notified, again without any wind controls. We have got an alternative recommendation there from Councillor Peters regarding height for Hornby, limiting that to 12 metres rather than the permitted 14 metres. And then for the town centres, for Shirley, Linwood, North Horswell and Belfast, that really is as notified, so 14 metres high density, except for Belfast Northwood and also for North Horswell. So Belfast Northwood, we had a slightly different response, which was basically just enable medium density, but at 4 stories, considering the scale of the centre. And the hearings panel have recommended to have high density around all of that Belfast centre. And for North Horswell, like I said, it's just medium density, so that's just the 3 stories around North Horswell. And again, there's no wind controls for intensification that council had proposed here as well. Any questions on the heights? Or
Melanie?
Sorry, the 20 and 22 metres both being 6 stories, what's the difference?
Yeah, so that changed to firstly seek alignment with what was permitted at the commercial level. So in the commercial zoning, it was enabled to 22 metres. We had 20 metres in the residential. We sought alignment, so it was just simpler if there was cross-boundary, zone boundary development. Also, the reason for the 22, the extra 2 metres, is that typically at the ground level there's a greater stud height for greater entrances, other uses and alike, and so it provides more flexibility along that front. Just to be clear, there isn't a limit in terms of number of stories, it's just a height control. So someone potentially could squeeze in 7 stories, for example.
Yanni, please.
So there was evidence received around the social impact and concern around the intensification in some of the lower socioeconomic areas, as I understand it. Our own evidence highlighted that there was a risk. The peer review highlighted some concern that there's emerging evidence that just leaving it to the market doesn't actually protect or help the most vulnerable. So when I look at the large local centre, the town centres, and I look at Linwood where it says suggesting comments, IHP recommended largely adopts council's final position on the matter, which responded to submissions and evidence received. Are you able just to clarify what we did, what the response was to those concerns that I've just identified?
No, we can't in the context of this meeting. This meeting is about the IHP recommendations up there. So if you've got any questions about other stuff,
So why did
if you've got any questions about other stuff, we'll make a note of them and we'll respond to them separately.
So why did the IHP agree to increase the height when the concern was around the displacement of vulnerable populations?
They haven't. So we notified 14 metres and they've accepted that and recommended 14 metres.
Sorry, I was talking about, and maybe I'm just confused in the document, but the large local, the town centres, it says permitted to 20 metres, and then it says IHP permitted to 22.
You might be looking at the commercial element.
Right, okay.
So we're on page 12. On page 15 is talking about the commercial heights. So it's only within the commercial zoning. Residential zoning is as we notified.
Thank you.
Right, okay, cool.
Great. We'll move on to the next page. Okay, so we're still talking about the heights in terms of residential surrounding the commercial centres. This page we have large local centres, medium local centres, small and neighbourhood centres. Most of this was really as notified, as listed there. So 14 metres permitted around the large local centres. The medium centres, this is really where it had changed. So we had, like I mentioned earlier, a precinct to enable 4 stories around specific centres, and the IHP have recommended that the specific centres are effectively rejected and all local centres should have a medium density response. So that's the 26 centres, all the pink areas on the map that we talked about earlier. The 8 that we had identified were Bishopdale, Barrington, Northwest Belfast, Hallswell, Prestons, Wigram, Sydenham South and Richmond. There is an alternative recommendation put forward from Councillor Templeton talking about the associated perimeter block development specifically for those 8 centres as well, and so effectively would be retaining all of the other local centres as they are and just applying the perimeter block controls that we had in our proposal, council proposal that is, for those 8 centres as well. Yeah, that's right. So some of the small local centres fit into that category of the 8 as well, because we had different catchments. That's right. Yeah. Around the neighbourhood centres, like I said, it's just MDRS, and the IHP have accepted that as well. Again, for all of these where we had wind controls, the IHP have recommended the removal of those wind controls. And I think that's it in terms of any alternatives or other details. Any questions on this page?
Melanie.
So Sarah's alternate, is that from the 14 metres or the 12 with the enabling recession frame?
12, yeah. So we had, you're right, we had proposed 14, and I believe Councillor Templeton's is from 12, which aligns with the IHP's recommendation at 12 metres as well.
Okay.
It just allows for some of those developments like that one on Selwyn Street, that with the the lovely pastel ones and those kind of things in those areas.
Great. Right. Move on to the next page. Okay, so from this section onwards, we'll talk about the commercial intensification within those centres. So right at the top, we have the city centre, also Central City Mixed Use Zone and South Frame equivalent as well. As no doubt you're all aware, much of the city centre has been decided on already. However, the residual would be considered as part of the December decision as well. Central City Mixed Use Zone, we had permitted height of 32 metres and then 21 metres for the South Frame equivalent. We do have a clarification outstanding for that because there are some site-specific nuance to that. But as it's currently drafted, the recommendation is that accepting council's position as notified. We don't have any alternate recommendations for those specific zones or the heights. For the large town centres, the commercial heights we had notified at 22 metres, 6 stories, and the IHP have recommended 32 metres or 10 stories, and that aligns with the position of council's final position on commercial heights there. There is an alternative recommendation that we have from Councillor Peters regarding the Hornby Town Centre as well, limiting this to 22 6 stories rather than the 32 that had been recommended. Any questions for those centres? No? Great. We'll move on to the next page.
Just referring to the wind assessments, I'm just sort of not sure. I don't really know the understanding around what's required and what's not, particularly from a scientific perspective through engineering. What was the recommended staff assessment or level of building? Sorry, I'm having a mind blank today.
No, I understand what you mean. So in terms of the wind controls that we had outside of the city centre, as we're talking about around the commercial centres, the evidence that we led was that from about 20 metres in height, there's a potential for buildings to catch wind and create adverse wind effects. And so there would be an additional consent requirement from 20 metres that is effectively to say you need to demonstrate that you meet this wind standard. It's not necessarily that you require consent. It's simply to say there's specific speeds of wind that needs to be demonstrated. And if you can't do that, then a resource consent is required. Typically, from my understanding, as a result of that, the building form is changed, its shape, so it doesn't catch the wind, for lack of a better term, as much. The hearings panel did receive the evidence that we had, but ultimately decided to reject that. And so that means then that for example, the 10 stories commercial that would be enabled for the likes of Riccarton or the surrounding high density around that, there are no wind controls for that. And so it's just building form, bulk and location that's largely considered, depending on what the proposal is, but wind isn't a factor.
So what's staff's position based on the evidence that you provided?
Staff can't express an opinion. So.
Oh no, sorry. Before the IHP's recommendations, what was your?
The notified position, what we went out with was to have those wind controls to apply from 20 metres. I think we potentially had a greater leniency for the commercial zoning, considering the lack of residential occupation within those areas. It might have been 25, 22 metres, I'm not too sure, but the notified position was to have those wind controls.
And is this for human error or engineering capability? So, for example, just to be frank, is this the heights for a person falling out of the building, or is it for the actual engineering of the building itself to be able to withstand those winds?
Oh, just to be clear, it's not about...
I'm sort of not understanding where we are with the wind assessment.
Yeah, so it's not about the engineering to make the building strong enough. That would be considered to the building code anyway. This is more about, say, for example, having a very tall building along a street frontage that has a straight blank facade, the wind catching that, forcing it down to the pedestrian and being quite a force
Very
to
clear,
pedestrians
yeah.
as well. So internationally, there's quite a
That
few.
creates potential wind tunnels and things of the sort.
Yeah, totally. So people
That's a
have,
better thing, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So people have balconies as well, and it means that the amenity of balconies and also the public is protected as well.
In layman's terms, the facades will mitigate the effects of the wind approaching the buildings.
That's the ultimate goal. Yeah,
Okay.
the building form's adapted.
Thank you. That makes it clear.
Great. We'll move on to the next page.
Just getting back to that, the evidence around or the submissions around the large centres and the height, were there submissions from people concerned at the commercial heights in terms of the impact, in terms of social impact?
I'm not too sure about the rationale, but there definitely were concerns about the increased height. Yeah, that's sure. And we also had submissions to go higher than the 32 as well. So for Riccarton and Hornby, we had submissions, I think, of 50 metres or higher as well. We had submissions to go less. And so ultimately 32 metres was rested on the recommendations.
What was the basis on which the IHP increased our recommendation for 20 metres to 22
So
for commercially?
from 20 to 22.
Yeah, and no wind assessment.
So the 22 is like I talked about with mentioned to Councillor Coker around making sure that the ground level is most functional, and so there's a greater stud height for entries, for shops and alike as well. Right. For any commercial zone, you can have shops at the ground level, offices, whatever the case may be, and then anything above can be residential. And so the idea is that the ground level is the statement piece, I guess. And so that was increased by 2 metres to allow for that flexibility.
At the moment, the current, like Shirley, Linwood, North Hallsville, Belfast, Northwood, how much are they at? What's the current heights of where they're at?
Most of them are 20 metres.
Most of them are 20 metres.
So increased by 2 metres.
Right. Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Great. All right, so on this next page, we have the town centres, large, local, medium, small, and neighbourhood. Pretty much, just looking down the list, most of those are really as council had notified. Like mentioned earlier, there's an odd case of going up by a couple of metres, so 20 to 22 metres. And in most other cases, when it's 14 metres, council had proposed that. Small local centres had a marginal increase from 12 to 14 metres as well. Again, there's no wind assessment for those controls as well. And we don't have any alternate recommendations for these centres, the commercial enablement either.
Thank you.
Any questions on those? Great. Right, that brings us to the end of centres, with the commercial side of things. The next section of the table is focused on other zones that are influenced by centre catchments. And so on this table, we cover off mixed use zone, specific purpose for hospitals, schools, tertiary education, and also Otakara Avon River Corridor. So council had proposed that the Sydenham area would be rezoned from industrial to mixed use. And the IHP have recommended to reject that. The recommendation to reject that is both based on the High Court precedent in terms of potentially being more restrictive than the status quo, and also the change in terms of the Policy 3 catchment for the NPSUD. There is an alternative recommendation that we have, like we discussed earlier, for Councillor Templeton, that would change the approach from the Walkham catchment from the central city, that would then include what we had notified as part of for that mixed use area as well, and we're ensuring that that mixed use goes ahead as well.
Yep.
I just the discussion we had the other day where you pointed out that because that decision came through after all of the submissions and resubmissions and things had been heard, there was no chance for anyone to put a case.
Yeah,
which is why it's worth us actually putting it forward and testing.
Yeah, there's a bit to be said around that. That's quite correct. So, for everyone's benefit, the hearings closed, and we were in a position up until that point that there was the precedent that was in the Environment Court for that particular case. And after the close of the hearing, the High Court issued its ruling, and that basically set the precedent in stone, for lack of a better term, in terms of our ability to or inability to set those additional controls. And there wasn't the approach made by the hearings panel to seek any input from parties, including council, on interpretation of that. And so you're right, Councillor Templeton, that it will be up to the Minister to decide whether or not that is applicable in this instance if it goes ahead.
Cool. Thank you.
Great. For specific purpose hospital zones, these are influenced by Policy 3, and so increasing the heights in accordance with the high density and alike around those areas really is as notified from the hearings panel. We have a minor query outstanding with the hearings panel at the moment that we anticipate hearing back on shortly on that, just regarding a few areas where the high density has changed. For specific purpose schools, effectively it's the same really as notified, where there's an underlying zone that's there and education isn't proposed, then the residential surrounding zone effectively takes over. For specific purpose tertiary, again, this is affected by Policy 3 in terms of intensification around those centres. And that affects ARA and University of Canterbury principally. You'll note there that this is in purple, and so staff are recommending that despite part of the area being outside of a Policy 3 catchment, that it's considered in its entirety. It is adjacent to part of the Policy 3 response as well, and would enable greater development within those zones, notably University of Canterbury as well. For the last line there, specific purpose, I take it Avon River Corridor. We had proposed to amend the schedule of private sites that are listed there. So, long story short, this is the zone that covers what's known as the former red zone. Part of that framework is to recognise private sites that still exist within the red zone. There are a number of sites that they aren't included in there, and we've sought to include that as part of the plan change for Plan Change 14. This is also subject to a separate private plan change request, PPC 11, and so the hearings panel have recommended to accept where council was as notified with some minor changes that is there, and effectively in doing so would mean that there isn't a need to progress the private plan change any longer because the landowner's issue is resolved. And so officers are recommending that this is also considered as well, being adjacent to a Policy 3 area, and making decision again resolves that request. Any questions on this page?
This was a really contentious thing in the community, so I'd be keen for us as a council to use the LGA or the normal RMA process to make this decision, rather than going through the special plan change, especially because this was in the red zone. And this is like residential going back into the red zone, which people are pretty upset about. So, yeah, just wondering what sort of amendment I need to put to enable us to consider it as part of a separate plan change.
Well, I guess it's about, firstly, in terms of being listed here and an officer's recommendation to include it, that doesn't mean that there is a need for an alternate recommendation. If that's your position on it, then effectively the way I see it, it would be listed in the decision report as a recommendation from staff, and then council would vote on it accordingly.
So, but normally if we were doing a private plan change, Has that hearing been held? Has that decision been reached?
No, it's been on hold because of its capture within Plan Change 14. The main reason it was included was that the walking catchment that council notified was a 1.2 kilometre walking catchment from the city centre, and that meant that those sites were included. And so we had to consider whether or not intensification within those sites was appropriate, because it was as we determined it within the Policy 3 walking catchment from the city centre, a minimum of 6 stories had to be enabled. What we put forward was a qualifying matter to restrict that, to say it has to be limited to medium density development, considering some of the site constraints that are there, and ultimately the framework that we had recommended was accepted by the hearings panel.
So basically, anyone could have put forward red zone property to get rezoned to be more enabling of housing, and we could have put it in the plan to enable it.
Incorrect. No. So the way that it is captured is through private ownership, and so there is an automatic, effectively, exclusion within the MPSUD for qualifying matters for publicly accessible open space. And obviously, much of the Otakara Avon River corridor is that. The vast majority is. There are still a number of privately owned sites within the red zone, and there's a schedule within the plan that enables for that private development within that former red zone. These people in this site simply have fallen off that list, hasn't been included, and are seeking to rectify that. They had done that through, like I said, Private Plan Change 11. It has, in a roundabout way, been captured through Plan Change 14 because of the scope of Policy 3 and the walking catchments.
Thank you. That's good.
Great.
Oh, sorry, Mel, and then Tyler.
With the mixed-use zone thing, so why is that less enabling than the operative plan?
Good question. Long story short is that the operative zoning is industrially zoned, and there is no height control in industrial zones. It's unlimited height control. So through us applying mixed-use zoning and having a height control, it can be seen as being more restrictive. However, we are also, or Council's notified position was also to change the type of activities that were permissible in the area, so to change that to being residential as well as other activities that are there as well. And so there's a mixture of an outcome, if you will, that on one hand you could argue that we are being more restrictive because we're having a height control that's there where there was none previously, but also we're changing the mix in terms of the activities that can be done on the site. And so, like I said earlier, it will be up to the Minister to decide how that resonates with the High Court precedent. It's not a clear cut as others put it that way.
So would it be possible to have an amendment where the heights are unlimited, but it's mixed use? So it's not. Is that a possibility?
We'd have to look at again where the submissions and the evidence fell on that. I'm not over the detail of it, but I can't recall a submission that specifically sought that outcome. So that would be the caveat to that. We can investigate that, absolutely, if that's an interest. But yeah, that would be the caveat I have to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that they took into account current use for the Victoria Street kind of area, but they didn't take into account current use for this area. So the current use in that industrial area is not really high, but it's also only 2% actually used for industrial. The rest of it's all just like storage and a bit of retail and cafes. So, yeah.
Tyler?
Great, thank you.
My question was around the tertiary education zone. Can we go back to the map? Now, to my understanding, that the University of Canterbury is looking to develop quite substantially around the area, particularly using some reserve space that they got. It's still early days, but would this allow the use of, say, for example, some of the university oval or anything else in terms of green space or greenfield development?
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to see on this map, but I'll try and zoom in a bit. But effectively, the area in purple that I'm circling in the cursor there is SPT on there is the full extent of that. And so there would be additional controls that could be applied to enable that kind of development. Effectively, how it works is that the surrounding zone, being medium density in this case, would apply for any such residential activities. And so that would be more enabling for the university within that purple area. So in terms of going wider than that, we're not recommending a decision wider than that, just the tertiary zone.
So there's multiple overlays within that, isn't there? There's the noise contour and there's a waterway that goes right through.
That's right.
Which is the Oakover stream, I think.
Yeah, so the waterway setback provisions still apply for any waterways that's through there. There are more bespoke controls in terms of height enablement for large parts of the university because they have very tall buildings anyway. And so there's, I guess, an operative leniency that's for that. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. No, that's awesome. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we'll move on to the next page. So in terms of that section that we had for other zones influence, the last two that we have there for residential guest accommodation zone and the brownfield overlay. The guest accommodation zone is, of course, obviously also influenced by policy 3, and the position is really largely as notified, with any other minor adjustments to align with the surrounding residential zones. Brownfield overlay, we had proposed to expand that effectively as, I guess, a pseudo mixed use enablement within brownfield areas or industrially zoned areas. And so we had proposed a few additional ones within Policy 3 catchments. And the IHP have recommended to reject that, and simply the operative industrial zones apply as well. So that's, before I go on to the next section, that's the end of the other zones that are influenced. Any questions on those two before we move on? No? Great. All right. This next section fundamentally looks at the overall approach to MDRS. The first part of that is looking at really what the urban extent was, and so to capturing which zones are in. As you know, that includes the likes of Littleton Township, but doesn't include expansion into rural areas. We had submissions to rezone rural areas as medium density or high density and alike. Those have been rejected by the hearings panel, and the hearing panel have accepted the urban extent of what council had notified. They have changed the application of MDRS regarding the residential hills zone. So in their eyes, residential hills zones that have operative density overlays that are less dense or more bespoke for those areas are outside of scope. So MDRS doesn't apply to those areas. So there would be, for lack of a better term, islands that exist within residential hills areas. And also we had considered that the residential new neighbourhood zone, which is the greenfield zone effectively, is part of the scope. And so the IHP have recommended that medium density zone or high density zone is applied accordingly as well. So that's it in a nutshell for the urban extent on that matter. I don't have any alternatives on there. Any questions? Great. So on this next page, we'll start at the top. This is effectively around medium density zone extent as well, and about where that applies relevant to Policy 3. Obviously, MDRS is the baseline to that. We had modified that in terms of the low public transport accessibility area. The hearings panel have, in terms of the extent of MDRS, again, accepted it as notified. However, they have recommended the removal of the low public transport accessibility area. The only exemption in terms of not applying medium density zoning is for the coastal hazards, like we've discussed earlier for qualifying matter, where there's 30% or greater coverage, that the operative zoning holds for those areas.
Ike, is it worth reminding us what the red represents?
Yeah, so the red is effectively areas that are beyond policy 3, and so there's no recommendation to consider that because they're just MDRS, so that only has to be considered next year. And the orange is where it's both within policy 3 and just MDRS, and we're recommending just the policy 3 extent is considered. And so that latter applies to the future urban zone, which is what council had proposed to replace the residential new neighbourhood, which is the Greenfield site. As I said, the IHP have recommended medium or high density accordingly. There is one area for commercial zoning, which is for Sparks Road. There's a new Greenfield development there, and they proposed commercial zoning there, which IHP have recommended to accept. Ridgewell Hill Zone, again, that's entirely outside of the Policy 3 catchment, so we're not proposing that that's considered, but like I said, that's a bit more bespoke to what council had proposed. And again, the community housing redevelopment mechanism overlay, we had recommended that to be removed because MDRS does more than that really anyway, but again, that falls outside of Policy 3, so we're not recommending any decisions on that. Any questions on this page? No? Great. All right, almost at the end here. Only 2 sections to go. So in terms of related provisions, we have strategic directions that set the tone of the whole plan, and we're required to apply, compulsorily apply, MDRS objectives and policies as part of the intensification plan change process. We had proposed to introduce that as well as amending others. The IHP have recommended retaining only the MDRS objectives and then also minor changes to reflect housing outcomes for Māori and associated housing changes relevant to the MPSGD as well. Subdivision chapter is simply amended as per the outcomes for medium and high density zones, and also amendments of outline development plans, basically structure plans, in accordance with how they've already been developed. Largely retained as notified, that we had there as well from the IHP. Transport chapter, we propose to make various changes to respond to intensification provisions such as pedestrian access standards and cycle parking provisions, noting that parking controls have been removed from the district plan, and that's also largely retained as notified in the recommendations from the hearings panel as well. Any questions on those related provisions before we move on to financial contributions?
So we are making, I thought we couldn't make changes to transport provisions. So we can only remove or?
So we'd only modified really what exists. So the pedestrian controls that we have there are no more restrictive than the vehicle access controls. That's a good way to see it. So any controls that we have aren't more restrictive than the status quo. Same for cycle parking provisions. We've simply amended that to current best practice rather than being more restrictive. So it's quite niche, if you will.
So just so I'm clear, so we're basically making it more dangerous because we can't do anything that's more restrictive.
So we didn't really have any evidence on that, mainly because we didn't, like you said, we can't be more restrictive than the status quo. And so if council wants to progress with any other controls beyond that for the transport chapter, then that has to be done in a separate plan change process.
So we could agree not to support the changes that are proposed if we were concerned about the impact in terms of making neighbourhoods more dangerous for cyclists or pedestrians or so forth.
So the changes that are proposed are really to ensure that there is access for pedestrians. But again, that aligns with what the vehicle access controls are. So an alternative would be framed around that. But if you're seeking an alternative to be more restrictive, then there would be obviously that caution that we have there.
Maybe it's just the language, but so I would definitely support putting in more controls around improving pedestrian access. But my understanding is we can't do anything that's more restrictive than our current district plan because
That's
that's
right.
illegal. So the changes that we're proposing would reduce the amount of space for pedestrians.
The changes, let's put it this way, in the absence of the changes that we were proposing or are proposing, there wouldn't be any pedestrian access requirement. So if you just had pedestrian access or no parking for that matter, there wouldn't be any requirement for pedestrian. What we've said is that there should be a minimum standard walkway width and all the rest of that. The way that we, I guess, get around that in terms of being more restrictive is it's no more restrictive than a vehicle access control that already exists in the plan as well. So it's kind of one and the same.
Right. Okay. So we are being more restrictive in terms of development for housing to make it better for pedestrians.
We're being more directive, we're not being more restrictive.
Great, good.
That's good. But if it's less land that the developers have got to build housing, then surely it's more restrictive, right?
But it's no less on a vehicle access that already exists there. So it's no more restrictive from a use of the site than a vehicle access would be as well. So the current controls state that if you have a parking space, you're required vehicle access, and there's standards for that.
So maybe if I just give a really tangible example, some of the intensive housing that I've seen, they have a really nice vehicle access, so you can drive off the street straight in, but there's no footpath for pedestrians or people in wheelchairs or prams or anything.
Yep.
People have to walk on the road, effectively the entranceway in, rather than have a separate footpath that you would think, and with all the, particularly some of the social evidence that we heard around the vulnerable and the disabled, or the barrier-free type thinking, that is kind of one of the things that does come up in our social impact, right?
Sure. Yeah, no, I definitely understand what you're saying. I guess these provisions are intended to control developments that don't have any vehicle access, to ensure that there's some level of quality for pedestrian access. If you want to have those additional controls for footpaths where there is already a vehicle access, then that would have to be progressed through a separate plan change process. Yeah. Thanks.
So, Yanni, you're saying that there's no room for the pedestrians because there's so many vehicles going in. Is that what
Yeah, because it's quite tight. So you'll have about 20 car parks,
okay, so then the question would be,
and then you'll have people
how
reversing.
does development get before that would trigger parks?
There is a threshold. I'm not too sure what that is, but there is a threshold in Chapter 7, Transport Chapter 4.
Right,
That.
so it gets covered at that. Once you get so big, then you have to have paths. You can't just everyone use one driveway.
That's right. It's a scaled response. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Great. All right. Last but certainly not least, we have financial contributions. So as no doubt everyone is aware, we had notified a financial contribution for 20% tree canopy cover, which was to the effect of that if canopy cover wasn't provided, that a financial contribution was payable. The hearings panel have recommended the rejection of the financial contributions for tree canopy cover, and the IHP recommendation is based on the merits of that, but also the legal limits of the intensification planning instrument, Plan Change 14 as well. We do have a separate alternative recommendation from Councillor Coker, which, if I can paraphrase, accepts the limits of the plan change process from a legal standpoint in terms of the controls of financial contributions, but also seeks that council will investigate a separate plan change for financial contributions for tree canopy cover. Any questions?
Aaron.
Just on that, because you want your canopy cover across your whole city. Can we not in our system have it that you can just buy the square metre? Say your site's 1,000 square metres and it's required to have 200 of canopy cover, that you can't just buy it somewhere else? And we might, as a council, sell it. Like, for instance, we're going to replant the Port Hills, so people start buying 200 square metre plots of the Port Hills that get replanted, which becomes the city's tree.
Yeah, so what you're outlining is effectively what the funds that this would generate is intended for.
Right.
And so what it was designed to do was to say that there's a a fund effectively that would grow in those instances where tree canopy wouldn't be provided. That money obviously goes to council, and council would then say, hey, within your local catchment, we will purchase land and we will plant that as well. And so that means that that administrative task of Joe Bloggs blind, 200 metre sections is absolved. It's just with council. The way that the financial contribution worked was it's geared to the relative land value within that area. So if you're in a expensive area, you pay more. If it's in a lower cost area, you pay less. And so that is
Doesn't that just put the price of housing up by 20%, the land cost?
We didn't have evidence that supported that position. The intention was that the catchment reflects the cost that will be on council to purchase land within that catchment, because we wanted it to make sure that the financial contribution was relative to where the development was happening. We didn't want it to go, for example, it's going to be developed somewhere in the city and then somewhere far, far away that's outside of that catchment has a tree canopy cover. We want to see the effects within the area that it's being developed. So that, in that respect, it was proportional.
And just to clarify, Ike, that you can still plant the trees and not pay the money.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, and so the idea was that...
on the same site, though, eh?
Yeah, that's right. So you didn't have to pay financial contributions if you retain trees.
Good design would have anyway.
Yeah, if you retain trees that were already there or planted trees, then you don't have to pay. So it's an incentive on that front.
And what was if you decided not to and pay the penalty, fine, whatever, what was the number? I've got it in my head, but I don't know whether I'm right.
How much the financial contribution would be? Is that your question, sorry? Yeah, so again, that depends on the catchment that you're in for the relative values, but if you didn't pay, it could be quite easily in the order of $30,000 to $40,000 per development or per unit that's created there. Yeah. So it's a high amount, but it was designed as an incentive for people to retain or plant trees. So,
yeah. Now, just in my head, say for argument's sake, you buy a section and you put 3 Hueys on it, 3 houses on it. That means it's 3.
So how it would be calculated is to say, what is the total site area for where those 3 units are, and what is 20% of that? And then it goes, okay, that's X and Y area. And then we had a schedule within the plan that said X and Y tree will have at maturity a catchment area of this. And then you figure out your pick and mix of how many trees you need. And so usually, it'd be in order of 2 or 3 trees that you need. And yes, they can be small, nursery trees, not giant oaks that we're planting and counting, the canopy that's there. It's the tree at maturity at 20 years that's measured rather than at the nursery.
That's good. Thank you.
Cool.
Right.
That brings us to the end of the table, folks.
Mate, I tell you what, you all three of you are all over it, and you're answering every question that anyone throws at you. So well done.
Thank you very much.
No, can I just recap on how staff are now going to use the information that we've got from these 2 sessions? So they've been really useful sessions. Thank you everyone for that. So what staff are now going to be doing is writing the report to the council meeting. And what that report is going to do is rely on the feedback that we've got in these meetings. So that feedback is, you've got enough information to make your decisions. If you've got any alternative proposals, we know about them. Those that have been raised in today's meeting, we'll now do some work with those councillors, Councillor Coker and Councillor Kewen, on fleshing out any alternative recommendations that might have come out of what you've raised today. So they'd be in the report as well. And so that is the list of the alternative recommendations that council might have to the IHP recommendations.
And we will have opportunity. We'll be able to vote on each one of those alternative recommendations separately.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it might pay to just quickly run through the summary of the alternatives that we have, because it's been spread over 2 sessions. So this is the table that we have running at the moment for alternatives. So I'll very quickly run through this. So like I mentioned, Councillor Coker's for financial contributions. Councillor Harrison Hunt and McDonald have raised around the Rickon and Bush interface and continuing with that qualifying matter. For for Councillor Harrison Hunt, we also have the alternative for Riccarton as well. Councillor McDonald, like I mentioned, around rejecting the centre intensification for Avonhead and Pier Street. For Harrison Hunt, again, we have the qualifying matter for the city spine, which is effectively the preferred mass rapid transport route and protecting development along that corridor. Councillor McDonald and Councillor Peters have raised around the sunlight access qualifying matter and retaining what Council had proposed there. Councillor Peters has for the high density catchment around Hornby a slight reduction on that. And Councillor Peters also has reductions for the building heights within the high density zone, limiting that to 12 metres rather than the 14 permitted. And also for the commercial heights to be reduced to 22 metres rather than the 32. Councillor Peters has also raised the qualifying, an alternative for the qualifying matter for the radio communication pathway for the Justice Precinct. We have an outstanding query on that, which again we're anticipating to receive shortly. And so subject to that, this may not be needed, but regardless, that's there. Councillor McDonald, like I mentioned, has raised an alternative for airport noise regarding the number of units and the limited notification threshold as well. Councillor Templeton has an alternative for the walking catchment for the city centre, which also affects the Sydenham mixed-use area. And Councillor Templeton also has it for perimeter block controls for those 8 local centres and their surrounds. Councillor McDonald has one to remove the Daresbury House heritage listing, and Harrison Hunt has one also for Antonio Hall heritage listing as well. And it's been raised around accepting the IHP recommendation for Pico Shans, but again, this is an alternative that's required. And as of today, we also have investigator looking at the Dean Ave former stockyard site to potentially 10 stories or thereabouts, and what submissions are around that, so we can come back to you on that, and also modifying mixed use zone for Sydenham to unlimited height as well.
Okay. Sure.
I was just doing some reading last night, and there's the old city care site down in Sydenham there, and some issues around the IHP not picking up on some stuff from CNZ. So I'd like an amendment for that. I've emailed through.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh, we got them all. Yeah, Aaron, then Vic, then Yanni.
Just on the old sale yard site, when you explore that, would that also in its zoning be allowed to potentially be a hotel?
No, so we're only focused
Why not?
on, because the scope of the
PC14,
PC14 is about,
residential only.
yeah, well, not residential only, but in this particular instance, it's not about changing the type of use. It's about changing the level of intensification. So policy 3 says it just goes up rather than changes the use. So in this instance, it's about going up. And so it's the level of intensification rather than its use.
So we can't make it a potential hotel as well.
No, that would be out of scope as part of the plan change.
If the landowner wanted to do a zoning change, he could.
Absolutely. Yep.
And would that be very hard on that site?
Well, I mean, we receive a number of private plan changes for spot zones over the years, and it's not impossible to do it all, and so they're able to do that. Yeah.
But if we've got the height, it might encourage them to look at it or consider it.
It could, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And is 10 a good height, or should it be 12?
Well, if you want alignment, 12 would be what we had in terms of the precinct surrounding city centre zone.
12 stories.
Yeah, we have a 39 metre precinct.
Let's probably do it as 12 in that corner and see what happens.
So again, we'll have a look at what bandwidth is there, but happy to investigate 10,
Thank
12.
Sorry.
It's easier to be lower.
Thanks for making a dedicated space on the BTC for all of the PC14 material. When can we expect that information to start dropping in there?
As far as I know, very, very shortly. I think there's just some checks to make sure that all the material that we've emailed out is reflected in there. So we want to make sure that that's all in there. But I'd say within the next 24 hours.
Thank you, Zeke.
Yanni?
So I've tried to find where the impact on Māori is considered, and it's quite hard. I know you sent a lot of links to things, but some of the links don't work, and you've got to scroll through like dozens and dozens and hundreds of pages to try and find different things. Has there been any discrete assessment of, what we notified in terms of impact on Māori, and then what the submissions were and what the changes are? I'm just mindful that we had a treaty workshop the other day, and it does seem it should be pretty incumbent on us to understand what those impacts are.
There hasn't been any specific work on that other than what's been sent, but we can take a look at what's been sent and see if there's any issues with that. We did have, I think probably the most standout in that regard would be, in my mind, submission from Ngāti Wheki, which is principally focused on Littleton Banks Peninsula. And as a result of that submission, we did seek the modification of objectives and policies to have wider consideration of housing for Māori and Ngāi Tai Whānui, and that was accepted by the hearings panel.
Right. It's just that, like when I read even the peer review of the social impact assessment, it doesn't even mention Māori or Pacifica, which, we heard through some submitters, they were concerned about the impact on Māori and Pacifica.
So if I understand the question, you're asking us to have a look at whether we can put another bundle together of information in the IHP, because we can't raise anything, obviously, other than what's in the IHP record. So you're asking us to see if we can put together another bundle with a focus on any consideration of impact on Māori.
If there was any response to concerns raised about Māori and Pacifica.
Sure.
Thank you. And the last one is Mark.
Thank you. Just wanting to check whether this big table is potentially available outside of this meeting to the public to access and peruse.
Well, it's a loggoimable document, so we're able to share it out. I guess the caveat I have is it's now outdated because we have alternative recommendations that are in there, and there's a few other amendments and stuff as well. So what I would propose that staff do is we go through and update this accordingly with where we're currently at with alternative recommendations, and then we can send around to councillors, and from there it's up to you, how you want to disseminate that.
It's been pretty public for the last 3/4 of an hour.
Well, exactly. And I guess the other thing too is the updated latest version of the proposed planning maps. Is that accessible anywhere for anyone?
The link that's been sent out to councillors is a publicly accessible link. So that information was included in a council memo to the hearings panel. And so anyone in the public can see that in the memo. And the link, as I said, is publicly accessible as well. So if we have duty planning questions that come in and people want greater clarity, then we've sent that out as well. There's obviously the caveat there that it is incomplete. So we've been quite careful about sending it out because we don't want to purport something that isn't fact. There's ongoing work internally in the spatial team, which are quite stretched resourcing wise, so we're quite behind in terms of delivering that. But we would hope that again, by the end of next week at least, that we have the publicly accessible comparison map. And that comparison map will show what council's final position was versus the hearings panel recommendation.
Yep. And would it include the alternate recommendations?
It won't, because it's not an IHP recommendation. Right. But we can, that'll be part of the decision report listing what those recommendations are, which will be made public by the end of this month.
That's right. Now, the only thing I'd like to highlight again in relation to the table being in the public domain is that, as I've said a number of times, the views of any member of the public on the IHP recommendations are irrelevant to your decisions on those recommendations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. That brings to the end our information session, and thank you everyone who stayed and listened. Have the rest of the day off.